All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Mindgasms. I'm going to do another talk about philosophy today. Tim Keefe and Shane Kennedy are back, and Hayden was going to be here, but I guess turns out that he's not able to make it. But we're going to talk more about Heidegger, and specifically, I think maybe a little bit more about his essay on phenomenology and theology, but mostly, at least, focus on his essay about Nietzsche's famous phrase, God is dead. So, start off, why don't you guys introduce yourself to those people who don't know you?
Okay, so I'm Tim, and I've been on Andrew's podcast before. Been studying philosophy for many years, well over 25, and it's been a continuing hobby. Definitely keeps my mind stimulated. And I'm getting more and more practice at doing this whole podcasting thing with discussions.
Awesome.
And yeah, I mean, geez, how would I say? I mean, I've been dabbling in philosophy. I kind of have my own personal epistemology that I've built up over the years. I'm trying to merge that with a Christian outlook, and I'm just kind of looking to understand how other people look at things and try to see the pros and cons of different lenses. So probably more than enough of an explanation at this point. I hope that serves.
All right. So, do you guys want to start off with I know we wanted to go a little bit more into Heidegger's essay that we were discussing last time on phenomenology and theology, and specifically, I think I still had a few notes about that one. If you guys want to go over that, and I know you were maybe going to take some notes on that too, Shane. So we could start off with that, and maybe you could just give a brief explanation of the essay again for people who didn't see the last episode, if you want to, Tim. Does that sound good to you guys?
Sure, that works.
Okay.
Okay, so the last time we were looking at a lecture essay by Heidegger titled Phenomenology and Theology. It's an early one. This comes before Being in Time, which was published in 1926. So just a little bit of the background is that Heidegger's philosophical background, he actually started in theology first, not so much in philosophy. He was born a Catholic and raised in the Catholic. He wanted to become he wanted to go to seminary at one point. So he was very much acquainted with Augustine and Aquinas and the Church Fathers and everything like that. And then he wanted to change to go into mathematics, which didn't work out, and then he got into philosophy. So particularly in his early career, he was crossing both, working in both areas, philosophy and theology. So this is where, in the case of this lecture essay, Phenomenology and Theology, you still see some of his theological background. And the essay itself, he's trying to make a distinction between what is philosophy and what is theology and what is the subject matter of the both of them, and how are the two, how maybe are the two influenced by each other. The one of many salient points that you can draw from the lecture essay is that theology is a science in terms of a body of knowledge, but philosophy circumscribes theology because philosophy is more concerned with asking the questions of the foundations of a particular subject, be it science itself, or in this case, in the essay, theology. And that's it in a nutshell. So I think we covered a lot of ground the last time, but you guys still had some notes that you wanted to discuss.
All right. So, Shane, would you prefer it if I went over the last of my notes first and then you went over yours? Because I know you had perhaps some to go over for like most of what we covered last time, or would you prefer going over some of yours first, or what?
I incorrectly assumed we were going to be focusing on the God is dead one. So
Oh, Oh,
That's the one
okay.
I did my prep on.
Oh, okay. Sorry about
So,
that.
but oh no, it's all good. So I mean, so for my purposes, if you want to just keep walking through, I'll just kind of do what I did last time and just try to follow it and see if I can't understand what's being said, and we'll see where that leads. How about that?
All right.
Okay.
Well, I'll start going off with the last of the notes that I took on then. So yeah, this is another part. Um, Actually, this is sort of just one paragraph that I thought was particularly interesting. We were talking about the sort of the difference between theology and philosophy, and like you were just saying, Tim, how theology could be seen as more of a science, and this quote is more talking about like what specifically science is, like as a separate thing in relation to philosophy and theology, it seems to me anyway, but I'll just read it here. So, to be sure, scientific communication between researchers in the positive sciences and philosophy cannot be tied down to definite rules, especially since the clarity, certainty, and originality of critiques by scientists of the foundations of their own positive sciences change as often and are as varied as the stage researched and maintained by philosophy at any point in clarifying its own essence. This communication becomes and remains genuinely lively and fruitful only when the respective positive antic and transcendental ontological inquiries are guided by itself. So, I think I sort of understand what that means. He's talking about how science uh, shouldn't necessarily have rigid rules if you want to perform it in the best way, and and he's talking about that at the end with respect to the positive antic and transcendental ontological queries, and they should be guided by itself. That part in particular I'm a little bit more confused by, but what's your interpretation of that, Tim?
Is he saying antic or ontic?
I wrote down antic, but I was just wondering as I read that if maybe I wrote it down the wrong way, because I was just thinking too about the difference between ontic and ontological as we were discussing last time.
Right. I think you meant to write down ontic.
Yeah.
Okay. So again, the one of Heidegger's key concepts is the ontic and the ontological difference. Now, quickly to re-summarize that is that both words come from ontos, the Greek word for being, referring to a being, but ontic refers to beings, multifaceted beings, such as the being of an apple, the being of the cap that's on your head, the being of the car parked outside, whatever it is. These are all individual beings. Ontological deals with being with a capital B, as in trying to answer the question of why is there something rather than nothing. So if I remember correctly in the essay, because I haven't looked at it since last week, is that science itself is preoccupied with the ontic, the individual beings, as is metaphysics. Now, Heidegger, before we cover this lecture essay, Andrew, we were talking about what is metaphysics.
Yeah.
So Heidegger is against metaphysics because metaphysics is mostly concerned with beings, individual beings, and the nature of those beings, but not being, capital B, itself. That's where the ontological comes in. So in focusing more on metaphysics, you're forgetting about being as the whole. And science is like metaphysics, focusing on the beings themselves. So the quote that you just read sounds like, yeah, science is not fixed. It's changing all the time. Its methods. It's still focusing on the ontic. But what is the ontological grounding of what the science is?
The ontic.
The ontological.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Remember, science is about ontic, but what is the ontological grounding of the science itself?
So in that sense then, is he saying like is he against science in the same way that he's against metaphysics, or is he saying that, or is he just making the point that science and theology are different in that way, and that like focusing through the lens of the ontic rather than at least attempting to focus on the ontological, but really having to be interpreted through the ontic?
Well, that sounds about right. In the beginning of the essay, he did say that theology is a science. But to clarify, is that science in the terms of a body of knowledge or a method of inquiry, not
Right.
theoretical science like quantum physics
Yeah,
or
yeah,
anything like that, or the scientific method. That's not what he's getting at. He's
yeah,
getting at it's a body of inquiry and the methods of inquiry for that. Now, theology already has a presupposition to it, because certain theological concepts are things you're looking at, such as salvation or the existence of God or the incarnation, or take your pick of whatever it is. Those are already predetermined within the Christian framework that he talked about. But that's not ontological.
right,
And then philosophy's task is to question those preconceived concepts, notions that are already within theology.
right. So in that sense, then I was thinking about this a little bit, and does that mean that, like, at least according to Heidegger anyway, that you cannot possibly analyze theology from a purely ontological perspective, because you always view it from the ontic view, and you could only view it from an ontological perspective if you actually were an ontological being or something like that?
Not quite with an ontological being. The first part makes more sense because, again, you can apply philosophy to lots of different subjects, not just theology. You can even apply it to science. That's why there is philosophy of science. What is science? What are the methods of science? What counts? What does the term an atom mean? How are they relating between the two? That's the job of philosophy. So philosophy approaches this not ontically, but ontologically.
Okay.
Like the being, capital B, of science, you could say. Okay?
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I was just thinking about that in a different way, actually, because even though I know you and I get into like sort of heated debates sometimes, Shane, and I get like too emotional or something like that.
You could say that, yeah.
Yeah, I think we both kind of do at times, but but anyway, like, it actually has helped me kind of think in different ways about these subjects too, because like you and I both have our different biases one way or the other towards like seeing these distinctions between theology and philosophy. And I think like trying to think about Heidegger in that context, and having Tim clarify exactly my like sort of suppositions, that at least helps me understand it. Does it help you understand it?
I did not completely follow the last point you were trying to make.
I was just basically saying that, like,
no, I mean the point. Sorry, the point you made about communicating, I got that, but the point you were trying to make about the ontology, and when you ended with the ontological being comment, I wasn't exactly sure what you were getting at.
oh, so I was just speculating and asking for Tim's interpretation on whether, like, whether Heidegger was sort of, he obviously doesn't say this explicitly, but whether he was implying, and I'm not saying that he was, and it seems like he wasn't, but I was just asking whether it seems like Heidegger is saying that we always look at philosophy through the ontic, like through our own individual lens, and that, like, particularly this second part, that he was making the claim that that you cannot possibly analyze theology from an ontological perspective unless you actually were an ontological being, just because he's basically making the point that you have to view it through the ontic or the individual perspective.
Okay, now I'm confused.
No, I'm saying.
Okay, well,
sorry, my dog's making a lot of noise. I was just saying that that Heidegger doesn't say that you cannot view theology from an ontological perspective unless you are an ontological being. He's just
what is
saying
that?
that.
What does viewing theology from an ontological perspective mean?
yeah,
I'm not quite
that part about an
I meant.
ontological being, that
I
doesn't make sense.
I think I meant. I might have meant a different word, like from. Like I mean that you can't view theology from an ontological perspective unless you were like an omnipotent being, like an actual god or something like
what
that.
what would it be to look at theology from an ontological perspective, though? What does that mean? I don't
Well,
get what that.
that's
I mean, it could be my failing. I just don't understand what that
no. I
means.
mean, like, like if some sort of god or omnipotent being does exist,
Yeah.
if you can you analyze theology from the perspective, can you really ever understand theology and analyze it from the perspective of that omnipotent being or god?
I would say no, because you're venturing in the territory where it doesn't make sense. But let me back up a minute here. So I think we're getting confused about the ontic and the ontological difference. Okay, let me restate this one more time. So let's look at everyday life. Okay, in everyday life, we're always faced with the ontic because we're dealing with objects. That's another way to look at it. Objects or particular concepts or people that are also ontic types of beings. You know, I'm interacting with you guys, we're on the ontic level. But I'm not interacting on the ontological level, which is being with a capital B. You could say, with some qualifications, is its existence itself. So what Heidegger was getting at with theology is that it is a science of the ontic. There are already ontic beings within theology. Many different kinds of concepts or figures or notions, you know, whatever it is. Those are already ontic. But then the task of philosophy is to take a step or two back from that and look at it as, why is it there? You know, again, it's the question of why is there something rather than nothing? Something which you're not, when you're focusing too much in the ontic, you're not aware of. But you remember the earlier essay that we looked at, Andrew, before we got to Phenomenology and Theology, when he talked about the nothing and angst. So angst is that dread feeling. The nothing is what emerges when you retreat back from the ontic, where, you know, like we're trying to get a simplistic explanation here, is like in depression. So in depression is when the color is drained from life, and that the beings, the ontic beings that you're interacting with all the time, they hold no meaning or they hold no interest. Then the nothing starts to intrude, and that's where the ontological comes to the fore, because then you're starting to question the ontic beings themselves. Okay, this is a bit of a simplistic and a roundabout way to describe it, because you, again, like with a lot of Heidegger, you just have to read and you have to sit with it. Well, what does he mean by ontic versus ontological here? Because he uses it in a specific term. It makes sense to me. It's because when I first came upon it many years ago, I'm just like, oh, okay, I see what he means now. But you can't describe being, capital B, adequately, because then you make it ontic. Just like the nothing, you make ontic when you describe, well, the nothing is, or how you define it. Okay, but I don't want to get too bogged in the ontological difference. Just to try to wrap this up, because we got a lot to cover with this essay, because it's quite long. Is that, again, his project is using philosophy to circumscribe, wrap around. That was the the metaphor I was trying to make, around theology as a science, its discipline, which deals with the ontic itself, many different ontic things. Okay? Are we good with that?
Yep.
Okay, Shane, we good with that?
Good.
Okay. Yeah, that's another essay that you can read again and again to really get into it. But as I said, there's a lot to cover here with the current lecture essay. It's quite long, so I don't want to spend too much time on the previous one.
Okay.
Okay. So without further ado, let's shift gears and get into the present lecture essay. This is in the book Off the Beaten Track, which is a collection of lecture essays across all of Heidegger's career. And the title of this one is Nietzsche's Word, God is Dead. Okay, so before we begin, we all know Nietzsche's passage from the Gay Science, God is Dead, correct? We have heard that in many different kinds of contexts.
Yeah.
Okay, so have you guys read through all of the essay? Or have you at least read the first part?
Yeah.
Okay, so I can ask a question at the beginning. Now we'll go through some of the parts of the essay that I highlighted. Is Heidegger actually talking about, or is Nietzsche actually talking about, God as a omnipotent supersensual being that has died? Is that what he's talking about?
I do not think so at all.
No, I don't think so either.
Okay, because, at least on the face of it, you know, this was something I remember coming across when I was first reading it, is that if God was an uncreated being, how could he die? Okay, seems like a logical contradiction, right?
Yeah.
God was not created. God is eternal. How could God as a being die? Okay, but lots of people who try to be funny, they look at this and they say, "Oh, you know, Nietzsche's an atheist, and like the graffiti on the wall is that Nietzsche says God is dead. Well, then God says Nietzsche is dead. Ha 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 ha." Yeah. Yeah. The height of sophisticated humor right there. Okay, but at least you guys had divined from reading the essay is that God is dead is not really a literal term or literal phrase here.
I mean, it seems like from my reading of Nietzsche's famous phrase "God is dead" is that he's talking about the way that gods are like commonly defined in our traditional Western culture and in the modern era.
Right. Okay. So I think a good place to kick off would be to go to the quote itself on page 161, which Heidegger quotes in full, and I'll go ahead and read it because it is probably one of the most significant passages in all of Nietzsche's works. Okay. So Nietzsche says, "The madman," this is an aphorism from the Gay Science, "haven't you heard of that madman who lit a lamp in the bright morning, ran to the market and cried out ceaselessly, 'I'm looking for God, I'm looking for God.' As there were a number of people standing about just then who did not believe in God, he aroused a good deal of laughter. 'So did he get lost?' someone said. 'Has he lost his way, like a child?' another asked. 'Or maybe he's in hiding. Is he afraid of us? Gone to sea? Emigrated?' So they were shouting and laughing riotously. The madman jumped into the midst of them, and his eyes transfixed them. 'Where did God go?' he cried. 'I'll tell you where. We've killed him, you and I. We are all his murderers. But how have we done this? How were we able to drink the sea dry? Who gave us the sponge to wipe the entire horizon away? What did we do when we unchained this earth from its sun? Where is it moving to now? Where are we moving to? Away from all the suns? Is there no end to our plummeting? Backwards, sidewards, forwards, in every direction? Is there still an up and a down? Aren't we astray in an endless nothing? It's the empty space, isn't it? We feel breathing on us. It has become colder, hasn't it? Isn't it always nightfall and more night? Don't lamps need to be lit in the morning? Do we not yet hear any of the noise of the grave diggers who are burying God? Do we not yet smell anything of the divine putrefaction? Even gods become putrid. God is dead. God remains dead, and we killed him. How are we to find consolation? We, the murderers of all murderers. The holiest and mightiest that the world has hitherto possessed has bled to death under our knives. What water can cleanse us? What ceremonies of expiation What sacred games will we have to invent? Isn't the greatness of this deed too great for us? Don't we have to become gods ourselves in order merely to appear worthy of it? There has never been a greater deed, and whoever will be born after us will partake, for this deed's sake, of a history higher than all history in times past. Here the madman fell silent and looked again at his audience. They too were silent and looked at him as were taken aback. At last he threw his lamp to the ground so that it broke into pieces and went out. I come too early, he said then. The time is not yet mine. The enormous event is still on the way, itinerant. It hasn't got as far as the ears of men. Thunder and lightning take time. The light from stars takes time. Deeds takes time even after they have been done. To be seen and heard. This deed is still farther from them than the farthest stars. And yet they have done it themselves. It is told that on the same day the madman forced his way into different churches and started to sing his Requiem Aeternam Deo in them. Led out and questioned, he would only reply, "What else are those churches then, if not the crypts and tombs of God?" Okay, famous passage.
Yeah.
So, with that, let's go ahead and go back to the first page of the essay on page 157, and let's look at what Heidegger has to say. Okay. So one thing to note here is that this essay forms part of a body of work that Heidegger has done on Nietzsche. Now, he also did a 4-volume lecture course on Nietzsche himself, apart from this essay, as mentioned in Nietzsche and other places too. Main thing that Heidegger is getting at here is that when Nietzsche says God is dead, he's referring to something metaphysical. Okay, let that sink in for a minute. He's referring to something metaphysical, but not in the way that you would think of it. As I said before, God is dead is kind of a logical contradiction because of the way that you usually define God. How can God as an uncreated and eternal being die? How can he be killed? Okay, the contradiction here. So, Heidegger's first note is when he's referring to the sensory versus the supersensory. Supersensory is, transcendent from here and so on. So Heidegger says, after the metaphysical reversal carried out by Nietzsche, but the God is dead, all that is left to metaphysics is to be inverted into the dire state of its non-essence. The supersensory has become an unenduring product of the sensory, but by so disparaging its antithesis, the sensory denies its own essence. Okay. And then later on he says, the dismissal of the supersensory ends in a neither nor, regarding the distinction between sensory, the Greek word aesthesis, and non-sensory, noeton, referring to nous, noesis, the activity of the intellect. It ends in the senseless. Okay, so with God is dead, Nietzsche is flipping this metaphysical thing on its head. So instead of there being the sensory and then God resides in the supersensory, this has now been flipped over, and now the sensory has been rendered senseless because you're pulling down the supersensory. Make sense so far?
Yeah.
Okay. Shane, you with me?
I was with you to that last sentence. I didn't understand that last sentence you said.
Okay, so let me put it another way. So the whole thing about God residing, usually, as one would think about it, is in the supersensory realm. Okay? Not in the sensory realm, because we can't see God, we can't directly experience God. That's up for debate, but for the purposes of this, the sensory and the supersensory. Okay, so when Nietzsche says that God is dead, then he is denying that supersensory part.
Yeah, that up to there, I'm crystal clear on what you mean. But when you
Okay.
with that very last idea that you said, where somehow the senses become senseless, I don't understand what that means. And then
So he says by so disparaging its antithesis, the sensory denies its own essence. And before that, he says the supersensory has become an unenduring product of the sensory. So
that I get. I get all that. That makes perfect sense.
Okay, you got all that.
But it's yes. But then Okay, so go on from there, maybe.
Okay. Well, I'll just go ahead and skip to the next one. So Heidegger continues, saying, throughout the following, metaphysics is thought as the truth of beings, small b, as such in their entirety, not as the doctrine of a thinker. In each instance, a thinker has his fundamental philosophical position within a metaphysics. For that reason, the metaphysics can be named after a thinker. Okay, so here's the first clue about a later theme that Heidegger develops about Nietzsche, calling him the last metaphysician. Okay, so those who are somewhat familiar with Nietzsche at least get the impression is that he's not really a metaphysician as in the vein of a Kant or a Hegel, that kind of a metaphysician, particularly when Nietzsche says that God is dead. Okay, but Heidegger again says that Nietzsche was the last great metaphysician. Now, why is this? Well, we'll have to get going further in the essay to see that. But here he's saying is that the thinker has a fundamental position within the metaphysics. So regardless of what the thinker might say, he's already existing within some kind of a metaphysical view, be it maybe he's a Christian, and so that's his metaphysics. He is a pagan, that's his metaphysics, or he's an atheist, which he also resides within a metaphysics, just not explicitly stated. Okay, with me so far?
Yep, sounds very good.
All right, so continuing on, Heidegger says, Nietzsche himself interprets the course of Western history metaphysically, namely as the advent and development of nihilism. Okay, very important concept with Nietzsche is nihilism. Okay, so to think through Nietzsche's metaphysics becomes a matter of reflecting on the situation and place of contemporary men, whose destiny with respect to truth is still little experienced. Continuing on, to reflect on Nietzsche's metaphysics does not mean that besides his ethics and his epistemology and his aesthetics, we also and above all deal with the metaphysics. Rather, it means that we try to take Nietzsche seriously as a thinker. However, even for Nietzsche, thinking means to represent beings as beings. All metaphysical thinking is ontology, or it is nothing at all. Okay? Follow so far?
I do think so.
Okay. How about you, Andrew?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. So, plowing right along. Okay, I just kind of highlighted certain passages that stuck out because this is a long essay and I don't want to get too deep in what he has to say. All right, so the next one is a reference of being in time on page 159. So Heidegger says, this thinking has been concerned constantly with one occurrence, that in the history of Western thinking right from the beginning, beings have been thought in regard to being, capital B. But the truth of being, capital B, has remained unthought. Indeed, not only has the truth of being been denied to thinking as a possible experience, but Western thinking itself, precisely in the form of metaphysics, has specifically, though unknowingly, masked the occurrence of this denial. Okay, so what he's referring to here is, number one, again, Andrew, what we covered in What is Metaphysics, in that Western philosophy lost its way at some point, and then became more concerned with metaphysics instead of being, qua being, being as being,
Right.
as we saw in the ancient Greeks. So there's a reference here. Also that, you know, again, in some respects, this is highlighting the ontic-ontological difference. Being with a small b is the ontic, being with a capital B is the ontological. Okay? So what he's doing here in the initial paragraphs is that he's setting the stage to examine Nietzsche as a thinker and what Nietzsche's metaphysics were, which seems a little bit strange and contradictory, because did Nietzsche have a metaphysics? Did he or didn't he? At least on the face of it, he didn't, but it turns out he did, according to Heidegger. Okay, so moving right along, next page. Heidegger says, one might suppose that God is dead, the phrase, expresses the belief of Nietzsche, the atheist, and hence that it is only a personal opinion and therefore biased, and thus also easily refuted by pointing out that everywhere today, many people attend churches and endure hardships out of their Christian trust in God. Yet the question remains whether the word of Nietzsche, which we quoted, is only an extravagant view of a thinker whom it is easy to characterize correctly. He went mad in the end. True. It must still be asked whether Nietzsche, if anything, is not rather expressing here the word that has always been implicitly spoken within the metaphysically determined history of the West. Before reaching any position too hastily, we must first of all try to think God is dead in the way that it is intended. Hence, we will do well to distance ourselves from the rash opinions that obtrude themselves at once at this terrible statement. Okay. So, yes, if you look at God is dead on the surface, you're thinking that Nietzsche is an atheist. Not the case. Because if God is dead, as Heidegger pointed out, why are there still people attending churches? Okay. Obviously, the word hasn't gotten out, regardless of how effective or ineffective the madman was in Nietzsche's passage. Okay. So then the next paragraph, Heidegger says, Nietzsche's word gives the destiny of 2 millennia of Western history. Okay. So let's look at this one here. So referring to Western metaphysics, focusing on metaphysics, instead of being as itself. So as I take this is that when Nietzsche says that God is dead, this is almost a logical conclusion of what has happened in Western metaphysics. Okay? So let that sink in for a minute. Let me know if that makes sense.
It does. I mean, one way I can kind of test if what I think it makes sense is the same as yours, might be the way that to the kind of the modernist positivist extension, right? Because
right.
I think part of the reason why one might make a claim that God is dead is because people are trying to practice a way of looking at the world where evidence is put primary, right? And inside that framework, is not the best way to characterize the modern framework, but in that framework, it's hard to support a concept of God, like the metaphysical God.
You mean like atheistic rationalism or something like that? Like what Sam Harris talks about?
Yeah, I mean, yeah,
Okay.
but I mean, the way I would look at it is, if there's certain presuppositions you have to make or faith claims you have to make to have a worldview where God kind of grounds it, or God's at the top of the hierarchy of values in the way that he's no longer is because we've killed him, right? So in that sense, by switching to a more positivistic base, because to a certain extent most modern thought is positivistic to some extent. There's usually some claim to evidence, or at least it tries to err more on that side. Is the way I see it. And so I think that kind of speaks to what the last point you were making there.
Right. Okay. So I think you're in the ballpark, Shane. Now let's refer to the earlier essay with Phenomenology and Theology. So Heidegger stated in the beginning of that essay is that theology was creedal. Okay. Remember the whole discussion about creeds? There is already a creed in theology. It could be, Apostles' Creed or Nicene Creed, Catholic difference or Orthodox difference, whatever it is. It's already a creed. It's a statement of this is what I, as a Christian, believe. There's no positivism associated with that. It's a creed. This is what I believe. And then tied up with theology is faith. Okay? Follow so far? Now, what you were saying about positivism is this was already afoot in the 19th century. Positivistic approaches to philosophy, trying to examine metaphysics or even doing away with metaphysics. So one way to look at this is that because of the history of Western philosophy and the history of Western metaphysics, this was bound to happen at some point, and that one would get to a point to question, well, what about God? Does God even exist? Can we do away with God because it's a silly concept, it's an outdated concept, and so on? Okay, this was happening in the 19th century already. Mm-hmm. It's not that, the new atheists or whatever it is today, Sam Harris and his ilk, this is nothing new.
Yeah.
This was around in Nietzsche's time, except in Nietzsche's time, and this, the outgrowth of nihilism is that it was significant.
Were there militant atheists like the so-called Four Horsemen and that crowd during this time period?
Oh yeah. As a matter of fact,
Yeah?
I came across a lecture on YouTube. I should send it to you. Is that even back in the medieval period there were unbelievers?
But like to the same extent, I mean, like viewing religion as a virus or something like that?
Probably. You just don't hear about them.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, but
Wow.
in the 19th century is when you really started to see a blossoming of the scientific method.
Right.
Okay, so again, going back to my earlier point, is that because of the way it progressed, this was bound to happen at some point. Now,
right.
When Nietzsche says that God is dead, and he's referring to a super-sensible and a somewhat metaphysical approach, is that what is this going to mean for the rest of humanity? That it was significant is because when you remove God at the top of the hierarchy as the source of all values, you're going to have hell to pay. And some scholars have commented is that that's what almost the entirety of the 20th century was, with two world wars.
And like I think you and I have talked before about some postmodern writers like Bauman, for example. I'm thinking of bring up that sort of point too. How like with the if we're going into the, as he calls it, more of the liquid modernity era, that it's something that has come along with that is this like basically removing the concept of God from the top of the like cultural hierarchy in a sense, and there being this void that comes along with that.
Yeah, so it's that's liquid modernity is the outgrowth of modernity.
Right.
Because modernity has reached a limit, and because it failed in some respects, then and I continue to harp on it, is that postmodernity is an emergent phenomenon. It's not a school of thought like some people like to focus on so they can attack it. It's rather just an emergent state of affairs. Okay, when you remove modernity and the modernizing impulse, then postmodernity emerges, except Bauman is more sophisticated in saying that modernity is still with us, and it's still classification, but along with that comes ambivalence.
Right.
You're not as certain as you once were.
Yeah. And I make that point all the time too, that like postmodern postmodern writers, what they do is they just have a particular form of analysis. Like it's like you said, it's not like a set of distinct worldviews or something like that.
Well, there could be a worldview. I mean, there's also a movement of postmodern theology, and in fact, something was called the death of God theology, which was popular in the 60s, I think it was, and I think it's still around.
I think Hayden and James Sullivan sort of are at least aware of that, because I've heard one of Hayden's podcasts where he was talking to someone about that, and I think James Sullivan has talked about it a bit too, because like that does make sense too, like to me, particularly like if you're talking about Derrida rather than Foucault, because Derrida's interpretations of religion seem to me like more favorable and less critical than the way Nietzsche seems to look at it. And I mean, I've thought before about how you could look at theology from that sort of postmodern perspective in a way that could help you construct like your own view of theology or something like that.
Right. It's based on if you remove God as the super sensible being, then a theology emerges from that.
Mm-hmm.
But what does it look like? I'm vaguely aware of it. I have been for years. I just never, I don't have the time to get that deeply into that kind of theology. There's also postmodern theology. In fact, I have the Cambridge Companion to Postmodern Theology. Maybe we can cover that sometime. Lots of good essays in there. But just moving on. So going to page 161 at the top, Heidegger says, as a young man, Nietzsche was already familiar with the disturbing thought of the death of a god and the mortality of the gods. So this was early on. In a note that dates from the time he was drafting his first work, The Birth of Tragedy, Nietzsche wrote in 1870, quote, I believe in the ancient German saying, all gods must die. Okay. And then he quotes Nietzsche from The Gay Science later on. So then moving on. Okay, so let's look at page 162. Highlighted quite a lot here. So Heidegger says, it is clear from this sentence, God is dead, that Nietzsche, in speaking about the death of God, means the Christian God. But it is no less certain and no less to be kept in mind beforehand that Nietzsche uses the names God and Christian God to indicate the supersensory world in general. God is the name for the realm of ideas and the ideal. Since Plato, or more accurately, since the late Greek and the Christian interpretations of the Platonic philosophy, this realm of the supersensory has been considered the true and actually real world. In contrast to it, the sensory world is only the unreal, this worldly world, the changeable and therefore the merely apparent world. The this worldly world is this veil of tears in contrast to the mountain of eternal bliss of the other side. If, as is still the case in Kant, we call the sensory world the physical world in the broadest sense, then the supersensory world is the metaphysical world. Okay, so now we're getting down to brass tacks here. So this, what Nietzsche is attacking here is Platonic Christianity. Okay, do you know what he means by that?
Like Christianity from the perspective of, well, more of a Platonic view of it. So does that does he mean by that more of the sort of so-called modern conception or something like that?
No. What do you think?
No.
I'll take a stab at that one. So, like in a Christian worldview, like the only like the realm of the spirit's the real world. Okay, capital S. Okay, and in that respect, there's a de-emphasis on, let's say, the ontics down below, and what you're trying to do is approach the kind of like the ontological things above. So in that sense, there are these pure forms. That's what Platonic usually refers to, world of forms kind of stuff. So in that respect, like when the Jews wear the little kippah on their hat, it's like God is this totality that you're below, you can't understand. And the reason you serve that spiritual realm, because the only way to transcend the limitations of the physical world is through rising to the realm of the spirit. And then the way you do that originally was with a covenant, if you were a Jewish person. And then Jesus comes along and says, actually, no, you can follow my example, and that'll give you a way to transcend the physical world. And you can go off and get closer. Well, I'm going to leave you the Holy Spirit, big ass, which is like a metaphysical thing. You can't see or touch it. And so in that sense, and that's why faith is so important in Christianity. Like that's why Jesus talks about it a lot with, people sinking in water or not believing, because you can't see these metaphysical things, you can't prove them with evidence. Hence why modernity or positivism can attack it so easily, because if you're going to start basing your definition of truth on evidence or empiricism, this idea that you're going to get all your power from faith and transcendent metaphysical spiritual things starts to break down, right? So that's the way I would look at the contrasting, the type of Platonic Christianity that Nietzsche thinks people stopped believing in at that time.
Right, or to put it more simply, is that Platonism is, even before Christianity, when you're looking at Plato, is that Plato downplayed the physical world. This was to use a Christian term, a fallen world. So you had objects in the physical world. This is where the forms come in. You have objects in the physical world that are common to each other. You know that something is a chair. You know that something is an apple, even though you've seen several examples of it. But there is one thing. There is one super sensible apple or chair or whatever object it is that exists in this realm of the forms. So already you're seeing in Plato the distinction between the physical world and a metaphysical or supersensible world. That's Platonism in a nutshell. Then later on, when Christianity emerged on the scene, particularly with the Greek form of Christianity, it was a merge of Platonism with early Christianity. And then you have the whole thing about God resides in the supersensible world, and the physical world is the fallen world. This is not the ideal world. You are hoping to get to the ideal world, the supersensible world, at some point, particularly after your death.
I disagree with the last part. You're supposed to unify the fallen physical world. That's make kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven. What that means is you're supposed to unify the two of them.
Okay.
That's what you're supposed to do.
Right. That's what you're supposed to do.
Yeah. So, and that's why. Yeah. So, anyways, we're going to start getting into theology if we go down that path. But yeah. So yeah.
Right. Okay. Following along, Andrew?
Yeah.
Okay. So next paragraph, Heidegger continues, saying, God is dead means the supersensory world has no effective power. It does not bestow life. Metaphysics, which for Nietzsche is Western philosophy understood as Platonism, is at an end. Nietzsche understands his own philosophy as the counter-movement against metaphysics. That is, for him, against Platonism. Okay? So, referring back to my earlier point about positivism is, given the way Western philosophy, understood as Platonism, has played out all these centuries until it came to Nietzsche's time, it's now at an end, and it was almost inevitable that this kind of thing would happen. Because the supersensible loses its legitimacy, so to speak. Okay? So continuing on, Heidegger says, as a mere counter-movement, however, it necessarily remains trapped, like everything anti, in the essence of what it is challenging. Since all it does is turn metaphysics upside down, Nietzsche's counter-movement against metaphysics remained embroiled in it and has no way out. In fact, it is embroiled in it to such a degree that it is sealed off from its essence, and as metaphysics is unable to ever think its own essence. Okay, so what Heidegger is saying here is that if Nietzsche is trying to do away with the supersensory, the metaphysical, he can't get out of it, even though he tries to flip it on its head. Okay, he would have been better off just doing away with it entirely and charting a different course, but he's trapped in it as he flips it over. Okay.
So it's like how Heidegger is talking about how you're trapped in your ontic perspective in a way.
Sort of. I mean, he also mentioned earlier in the essay is that a thinker exists within some kind of a metaphysical milieu approach, even though that person might say they're anti-metaphysical. Well, depends on what you think. Now let's take our favorite whipping boy, Sam Harris. You know, Sam Harris, he thinks he's, and in fact, I was watching Cuck Philosophy's takedown of the moral instinct, and that was just a brilliant approach. And it's just like, man,
moral landscape.
The moral landscape, and it's just like me. I mean, I was of two minds. Is that me, having studied this for many years, is that how effing sloppy is Sam Harris in his methods and his argumentation, and yet this guy is part of the intellectual dark web, and he's all kinds of interviews and things like that. It's more of a comment to the lack of sophistication that seems to exist in the wider culture versus Sam Harris being a sloppy intellectual.
I think I found it really interesting when I was reading that one of those essays you sent me, "Why I Am Not a Christian" by Bertrand Russell, that he was basically steel manning some arguments for religion, and I noticed these arguments for religion are arguments that Sam Harris uses against religion. And he says that Bertrand Russell gave him these ideas, which is strange to me.
Yeah, he gets them wrong.
Yeah.
Man. Yeah, but my point is that Sam Harris exists kind of in a metaphysical approach too. It's all about science. You know, science can prove everything.
Yeah, science has a metaphysical value.
Right. Right. So that's Heidegger's point, is that a thinker is kind of already exists in sort of a metaphysical approach.
Right.
And that, I mean, and that's why Peterson would say Sam Harris is not an atheist, because he's still basically worshiping metaphysics, like the same way that the God Nietzsche says is dead is metaphysical values existing in that realm you're ascribing your faith in. Because and that was what the whole debate was between Peterson and Harris, which was Peterson basically asking Sam for 8 hours, can you please ground your faith claims based on this metaphysics you support in something? And Sam's reply is, what can I say to make the audience laugh? Because that's pretty much the only reason I'm even on the stage in the first place.
Yeah.
You know, but so anyways, the point is when if we're going to agree earlier that God is this metaphysical set of values, and if we're going to agree Sam Harris is a metaphysical a set of values he's describing his belief system to, in that way they are both faith believers in those unseeable, unverifiable, unfalsifiable metaphysical claims by definition, right? So that's what Peterson means when he says Sam Harris isn't an atheist.
But I want to say though, I'm annoyed by Peterson saying that, because I understand that from the perspective of metaphysics. Like, people have opinions on metaphysics if we're talking about it, but like to me, when I call myself an atheist, it just means that I don't believe in anyone's conception of God when they explain it to me. Like, I just don't believe in the existence. That doesn't mean that I claim that I am right about that. I just don't have the faith in the existence of God in the same way as someone who believes in the existence of God.
Yeah, I know that you feel that way about that, and I just thought it was quite timely while we're whipping on Sam Harris, while we're talking about a metaphysical God.
But you know that. Sorry, I interrupted you. Sorry.
Well, I don't want to get sidetracked into what you mean when you say you're an atheist, because that would be outside. That would be no longer even remotely in the realm of what we're talking about with this essay.
I understand what you're saying, and I understand what Jordan Peterson means when he says that. I'm just bothered by someone telling people that you are not the label that you decide that you have, because I don't think anyone has the right to tell them that their label does not apply to them.
Maybe we should table that one.
Yeah. I'm not going to comment on that. That's outside the purview of this. So.
Okay, just for all intents and purposes, Sam Harris is a charlatan. Next. All right, so moving right along, we're going on page 163 here. Heidegger continues. The attempt to comment on Nietzsche's word, God is dead, is synonymous with the task of explaining what Nietzsche understands by nihilism, and therefore of describing how Nietzsche stands in relation to nihilism. However, since this name is so often used only as a tabloid slogan and not infrequently as a damning invective, it is necessary to know what it means. Not everyone who adverts to the Christian faith or to some metaphysical conviction thereby stands outside nihilism. Conversely, to ponder about nothing and its essence does not necessarily make one a nihilist. So in the earlier paragraph, he was talking about how God is dead is something about a nothing and then it spreads. Nihilism, the eeriest of all guests, is standing at the door, so Heidegger says. Okay, so in general, this was the fear that Nietzsche had in saying that God is dead, because then nihilism will take root and start to spread. Because you have abandoned, destroyed, choose your term, abandoned or destroyed the crux, the linchpin of all values in the Western world up to that point. So then nihilism, as I said, takes root. And then people start to ask, well, what is the basis of anything at all? Particularly of ethics, morality, and things like that. Okay. And again, as I said, some commentators have judiciously noted is that this is what the 20th century was about. That playing out. Okay. Right. So Nihilism. All right. So down at the bottom of the page, Heidegger continues. He says, Nihilism, thought in its essence, is on the contrary the fundamental movement of the history of the West. Again, this was bound to happen. Its roots are so deep that its development can entail only world catastrophes. Nihilism is the world historical movement of the peoples of the earth who have been drawn into modernity's arena of power. That is why it is not only a phenomenon of the present age, nor even a product originally of the 19th century, when admittedly a keen eye for nihilism awoke and its name became common. Okay, it continues. Nihilism does not prevail only when the Christian God has been denied, or when Christianity is embattled, or when a free-thinking cheap atheism is still all that is preached. He continues. As long as we grasp God as dead only as the formula of unbelief, we are thinking in terms of theological apologetics and are eschewing what matters to Nietzsche, namely reflection that thinks about what has already happened with the truth of the supersensory world and with its relation to man's essence. Okay? Following along so far.
So where he says there that, like, where he's basically saying that nihilism has been around for a long time. How long has nihilism been around for?
Oh, probably since philosophy's early days, going back to the Greeks.
Oh, okay.
He's not specific. I think definitely what he's implying is that the seeds were already there.
Okay.
The seeds were already there because, you know, as I had mentioned with that one lecture, is that even back in the medieval period, who one would think was consistent in Christian belief, but there were doubters. Now, maybe they weren't nihilists and thinking that there was no value, but they questioned whether there was a transcendent, a supersensible God.
Yeah.
And then what's the logical conclusion for that? Well, if there is no God, then what is the grounding of any kind of morality?
And that makes me think about how one thing that that Foucault writes about is how it's sort of only since the modern era has there been, like, the way that people tend to see religion in this way that we associate with the modern era. Like, a lot of people think that it's the oldest way that people have seen Christianity, for example, but it's actually historically fairly new.
Right. One could even say is that, you know, going back to the pre-Socratics, and Heidegger has written extensively on the pre-Socratics, is that they were some of the first to have a philosophical view where they they did not believe in the gods, the Olympian gods. They took them as maybe metaphors for something. And then this is where the birth of philosophy emerged. So they didn't need a god or gods to try to find what values there were to be found. But the seeds kind of were there in dealing with that, but it was more pronounced, definitely, in the 19th century, because this is Christian Europe we're talking about, in that now things are coming to a head, particularly with Platonic Christianity. Probably had Christianity and Platonism never crossed paths and seeded each other, things might have turned out differently, but they didn't.
Okay, go on.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Okay, so
how do you think it might have turned out differently if that had happened?
Well, I would say look at the history of Christianity. There are many different Christian churches besides Catholics and Orthodox. There's proto-Christian churches, the Gnostics, the Coptics. You know, this is where it pays to study the history of religions and just see, you know, I came across this when I was getting into history of religion and theology. You know, in the early days of the Christian church, there were many battles going back and forth, all kinds of councils and heretics and this, that, and the other going on to try to really narrow down, as Heidegger had mentioned in the previous essay, the creedal approach to this theology. This is what we believe. And there are many ways to believe it back then.
Christianity without Platonism would probably look a lot like Islam looks today, I would think.
That's a good point.
Because you don't have any mechanism by which to challenge itself. That's where you get the infallibility of the Quran. There's no truth mechanism outside of these pure creedal kind of way of looking at things.
That's a good point. That's a good point, Shane.
Yeah.
Oh, so you would see it as a benefit then in that sense, hey?
Who would see that as a benefit?
You.
Well, I wouldn't say that it was a benefit. It's just this is probably what it would look like. And Shane's point, I think he's correct on that. Is that within?
I'm not saying he's incorrect.
Within Islam, it is. I mean, the word Islam is submission.
Yeah.
You don't question. Now, yes, there were Muslims in the past who questioned. Some of them did not leave this world alive. But others were, if you look at the Arab philosophers, they were questioning somewhat. They weren't unquestioning believers. They were a little more sophisticated, just like Aquinas was.
Yeah.
So
isn't like the way the way a lot of people see Islam today kind of also historically recent in a similar sense as Christianity?
Well, yes and no. So Islam of the Abrahamic faith is recent compared to the others.
Oh, yeah, of course.
Yeah, but political Islam, and in fact, Bill Warner, if you don't know about him, check him up on YouTube, has devoted several years of research to political Islam as its own movement. This is something separate from Islam, the religion. And in fact, as he notes it, because he has simplified versions of the Quran that are more palatable to the West, is that a lot of political Islam are already the seeds of Islam.
Yeah, I would say Islam to me is much more of a political ideology than a religion. Like it's certainly much more so than say Christianity or Judaism, because by having no truth-seeking mechanism and by drawing no distinction between church and state, you're at a pretty total authoritarian system pretty much right out of the get-go.
Yeah.
So.
That's interesting. So do you guys think that's more of an inherent character to Islam in comparison to Christianity then?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, because
that's something that you guys agree with Sam Harris about.
I'll bring in a side example. I had a professor. He was an Indian guy. This is when I was in grad school, and he was a pretty sophisticated guy. He was Indian and he had Pakistani friends. And I remember we were talking briefly about Islam one day, and he said, just remember one thing. If anybody ever tells you that Islam was never spread by the sword, they're lying.
Yeah. Well, the Crusades are an easy example, right? Those were wars between Christians and Muslims.
Yeah, and part of that was to stop the Muslim threat.
Yeah.
Because they were encroaching upon Europe, particularly in the early days. It started from sometime in like the 7th or the 8th century. The Byzantine Empire almost folded like a cheap suit because it was under assault by both the Arabs and the Bulgars. They had to voluntarily simplify their society and live that way for a few centuries before they started to push back.
Yeah.
Very much so, very much so. Although, funnily enough, part of the only reason the Crusades actually really worked, especially the first couple, is because that was, for other reasons, a weaker time for the Islamic world.
Right.
So that was a happy coincidence. So.
Right. Happy coincidence. Yeah.
Well, I mean, my biases are pretty correct.
Yeah. Of course. Of course.
Yeah.
All right. So continuing on. Let's see. So Heidegger continues. He says, for Nietzsche, Christianity is the historical, secular, political phenomenon of the church and its claim to power within the formation of Western humanity and its modern culture. Christianity in this sense and the Christian life of the New Testament faith are not the same. Okay, important point. So let's ponder
what does he mean exactly by that?
Okay. Shane, you want to take a stab at that?
Just one more time, please.
So he says, for Nietzsche, Christianity is the historical, secular, political phenomenon of the church and its claim to power within the formation of Western humanity and its modern culture. Christianity in this sense and the Christian life of the New Testament faith are not the same.
Yeah, so I think that would come back to the Platonic version of Christianity, would be some sort of idealized abstraction of what it would be to be a Christian. And to some extent, that could diverge from the physical manifestation of Christianity on planet Earth, right? So, because again, I think one way of seeing that is whatever Christianity would be because in theory, like things that could be labeled Christianity as a physical church, as physical Christians, could in theory, within reason, be almost anything, right? You can go from Mormons thinking they're Christians to Gnostics thinking they're Christians, and there's a huge difference in what that actually means. So at some point, you're going to draw a distinction between some idealized version and the physical manifestation at a time. Is that, did I kind of capture that right, or what do you think?
Well, that's part of it. This is also referring to the state religion, organized religion. So Kierkegaard is another person who was very critical about state religion. He was against the Danish Lutheran Church. And so part of his project was how does one become a Christian within Christendom? Okay, so the distinction here is that you have the church as the community, as the state organized religion, and then you have the Christianity of the New Testament. So I would aver is that, yes, one can be a Christian in the New Testament sense, but not belong to any organized and definitely not a state-sponsored church. Okay, but as Heidegger points out, is that, Nietzsche was raised as a Protestant Christian. Okay, so
Right.
he knew about the Protestant church, Lutheran in Germany at the time. That's what was dominant, even though there are Catholics in Germany, particularly in Bavaria. So he was raised a Lutheran. His father was a Lutheran pastor. He aspired at some point to be a Lutheran pastor, and then Heidegger was a Catholic. He wanted to, side note, he wanted to be in the seminary too, but then he changed and went into philosophy. So Nietzsche is against the church, the historical, secular, political phenomenon of the church.
Right.
Okay. He's not talking necessarily about the New Testament faith.
So what does New Testament faith mean in this context?
One is a Christian.
Oh, okay.
Following the teachings of Jesus.
Okay.
Okay.
Whereas I can take over the church and put political motivations in it, force you to be a part of it, and to some extent that starts to depart from what the New Testament faith is, right?
Right.
Like at some point, because again, once it becomes a political power structure with a physical manifestation, in some ways it can't be in perfect concordance with whatever interpretation you have of the idealized version of the New Testament, as clearly as you can even define what that is. So.
Right. To give a cruder example is that you can have a lot of churchgoers who are complete bastards.
Yeah.
And they call themselves Christian.
Yeah. My former boss was one of those.
Yeah. And what's even worse is a born-again Christian.
Yeah. And also, like, to your point, Shane, if you get really political with the religion, that seems like within the context, especially if we're talking about the New Testament rather, that seems like totally against the project of what Jesus was trying to do, because he was against the political power of the Roman Empire in a way, right?
Actually, well, some Christians would try to argue that you really shouldn't even participate in wars. You really shouldn't even participate in the political process to a certain extent.
Mm-hmm.
They would take it that far. I suspect that is kind of fairly consistent with what probably was intended, because there's ambiguities built into the system by definition, because it's going to leave itself room to maneuver as it goes forward. But my personal opinion is that Christianity was trying to switch the game. So it said, okay, we've lost in this physical realm of war and violence. We need to move into the spiritual realm. We can win on that front. So that's why we're gonna pull out of the political realm. We're gonna segregate ourselves from society, because that's a game we can win for the hearts and minds, so to speak. And I think that's pretty consistent as to why the church for fairly long time resisted political manifestations, and probably has something to do with why it kind of gets into a really weird place when it does.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
Christianity became a state religion in 313 with the Edict of Milan.
Oh, I was going to ask you guys that question.
Yeah. So you can look at this. You can look at this in both ways. Is that you were saying that was a good thing because Christianity spread, but it was also a bad thing. It's because then it became corrupted by politics as becoming a state religion.
Right.
And then when we get to Nietzsche's time, you have the German Lutheran Church, and to the same extent in Denmark with the Danish state church that Kierkegaard was railing against. So then it's the question of how does one become a true Christian within Christendom, using Kierkegaard's question. So the two main points that Heidegger is focusing on is that Nietzsche was against Platonic Christianity, the supersensory realm, and he was against the state church. Okay.
Right.
These were the two. This was the two-pronged attack here. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
But then,
so that means he's against everything about Christianity. There's nothing left besides that, is there?
well, there could be.
Which would
There could
what?
be. Now, there is a book that I've been meaning to read. Is Julian Young, who's a very well-known Nietzsche scholar, who it's called Nietzsche's Philosophy of Religion. That actually Nietzsche, with the whole God is dead business, actually was religious. He still was that. And also some people are saying is that Heidegger was trying to, with the capital B, trying to square the circle somewhat with philosophy versus theology, and that being was God, except it was desacralized or whatever it was. That's another interesting interpretation that I'm not going to get into right now.
Yeah, that's the realm where my mind's going. Like
Right.
in terms of what my personal project is more in that kind of space.
Is
Right.
that
Okay.
sort of like pantheistic or something like that?
Well, it could be. I mean, I guess one way to describe it is that it's the whole atheist thing, which is probably is best served for another podcast. Is that atheism is not anti-theism.
Yeah, not inherently.
Remember that distinction. Just because you do not believe that there is a supersensible, an atheos, okay, there is no divine. You don't believe in a divine.
Yeah.
I think that's a better way to describe it. Going back to our discussion with the Stoics.
Yeah.
Theos instead of God.
Being an atheist doesn't mean you have to be an anti-theist atheist like Sam Harris and all his buddies.
Yeah, the anti-theist is just that, well, it's silly that anybody would ever believe in a super sensible being and blah, blah, blah. But we also worship science. Oh, we're not going to talk about that.
Yeah.
Yeah. But anyways, so I don't want to get too sidetracked by this. Heidegger continues. In God is Dead, the name God, thought essentially, stands for the supersensory world of ideals that contain the goal that exists beyond the earthly life or this life. They determine it thus from above, and so in certain respects from without. But when the pure faith in God as defined by the Church fades, when theology in particular, the doctrine of the faith, finds itself curbed and forced to one side in serving its role as the normative explanation of beings, small b, in their entirety, then in no way does that fundamental structure break down in accordance with which the goal set on the scale of the supersensory has dominated the earthly life of the senses. Continuing, the place of God's vanished authority in the Church's profession of teaching has been taken by the authority of conscience and forcibly by the authority of reason. Okay. Key point right there.
I got cut off for like 10 seconds there. I missed the last part of what you said.
Okay, so I'll read the last sentence. He says, the place of God's vanished authority and the Church's profession of teaching has been taken by the authority of conscience and forcibly by the authority of reason.
Oh, that's interesting.
Okay, so we see another point here. So Nietzsche was against Platonic Christianity in the supersensible realm. He was against the Church defining God and defining faith. And now that authority has been turned over to conscience, in terms of values, and the authority of reason. So going back to an earlier point, is that Given the way things progressed over the centuries, this was bound to happen. The doubting of the structure in place, reason, scientific method, blah, 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 is now coming to the fore. Now you start to question that was taken on faith or taken as true, you know, incontestable for so many centuries. Now does this come under assault, and then you wind up with God is dead.
So it's like a consequence of the progression of values in the modern era.
Right.
I just would like to make one clarification. Like, it's from a descriptive point of view, it's obvious that that battle occurred, especially if you're looking at it phenomenologically. Like, a lot of people did start to think that way. I think that's pretty clear from a Western perspective in particular. People did start to supplant conscience and reason for that value. But whether that is what the end result of that battle will be, as opposed to will reason stay in its dominant role, will God just be put back up on his throne like a phoenix that's gone down and come back up? It's not exactly obvious. And I mean, that's kind of where Nietzsche goes, right? And that's where this essay is going to go. It's going to start talking about, okay, so with that space vacant, are we just going to put something in that same space, or are we going to go a whole different direction with our will to power, right? So,
right.
So depending on how you interpret that particular quote, the result of that conflict implicitly can seem more defined than I think it really is. And I see that in a couple places in the way he describes things. I mean, and I mean, you can guess why I'm sensitive about that, because you know what outcome I want that to happen next.
Yeah.
But that being said, it's not. I think it's very. I'll just say that, like, the heirs of that battle themselves could be replaced by people of different intellectual traditions, and this whole intellectual tradition could be irrelevant. It could go. We could revert back to or reclaim our old things, or we can invent something new. And this is a very, very much an open question. So
you could do something like what Hayden Bruce advocates for, which is the idea he gets from pragmatism of pluralism, just like different views of religion.
Well, that comes from James, his pluralistic
Yeah, William
approach.
James. Yeah.
The pluralistic approach.
Is there any evidence of that ever existing and working?
What?
What historically is that pluralistic approach ever worked?
I think so, because there already was an implicit pluralism even within the Christian world or outside of the Christian world. Maybe.
What do you think? What would be a concrete example of that you would use?
What? Say it again.
Like, what would be like a place in time where you'd say where a pluralistic approach to that question's been employed?
Well, I would say maybe around the time of early Christianity, because there were many creeds competing. Sure, they all believed in Jesus, and historians look back and they say that they were all Christians, but the creeds were definitely not the same.
No.
There already was a pluralistic approach there.
Yeah. Well, we can stop this too much of a tangent, but I think that we see this collapsing of ideologies, of belief systems into unities. Like, I think if you look around the world right now, most areas tend to either be dominated by a single way of looking at the world, or two opposed ways competing very tightly. I don't think there's any. So to pose the question again, I can't think of many times where this kind of plurality managed to sustain itself and didn't really either collapse into one belief system more or less, or maybe stay polarized. So
aren't there? You wouldn't say that there are many different, like, plural views on religion today?
What would that mean?
Aren't there a lot of different ways of looking at religion, and many different religions, including Christianity, right now?
I would say the type of metaphysical values that underpin, like the presuppositions that underpin society. I would say the vast majority of Westerners all share that to like 95%. Like, it's
that much, that high?
Well, I mean, we're arguing over, like, what are we actually arguing over from, like, a deep value level? Like, the exact balance of equality of outcome versus equality of opportunity, presupposing value of human life, more or less due process, like more or less human rights. Like, it's in terms of, like, really like some of the fundamental variables you can organize your society around. The tribalism makes it look like there's a lot of divergence, but I don't really see that much of a difference between from a Democrat to a Republican compared to, like, let's say, an early Roman to a modern person. Like, that's a huge gulf.
Well, I would agree with you if you're talking about like actual politicians. If we're talking about politics, like the establishment, as we could call them, on both sides, like they're whether you're Republican for a Democrat, generally you're really pro-war, for example. But if we're talking about it at the individual level, I mean, obviously this isn't scientific data and I have a small sample size, but out of all of the Christians that I know, most of them seem to have like at least slightly different views on religion, and like don't necessarily share all of the same values. And the people I know who have the most extreme rigid views are like the people in my area, which have more like stereotypical conservative fundamentalist views. But I know a lot of people like Hayden Bruce, for example, who has a very different perspective on Christianity than that.
Yeah, let's return back to the text. I'll just say that I think all that variation you talk of, which is legitimate, value, true, from a fundamental values, from like a fundamental principle level, they are agreeing on so many presuppositions and ways to see the world that, yes, they're arguing about things that seem to make them very stark differences, but in terms of like general orientation, for me, it's within a very narrow band when you consider all the different foundations you could build a worldview on. And I mean,
Okay.
that would be a huge conversation to have. But the idea of this pluralism would be to what extent you're going to actually allow like some of the base fundamental commitments you would make value wise like once you make, for instance, the reason Platonism eventually comes back and eats Christianity is there's a logical extension of the way that value of looking at the world is going to end up make you interpret your Christianity. So to the extent it was inevitable, that value has to play out a certain way, right? So that would be a type of orientation that's going to end up defining a lot of other things you're going to believe and do. So what I'm trying to say is in the same way that Platonism inevitably did that, those kind of inevitable contradictions, a lot of those have played out in Western society to a large degree. So it's the differences we do have are not as severe as they might have been in an era before, where some of these basic questions were up for grabs.
So would you say then that you don't think that William James's idea of pragmatic pluralism is actually that pragmatic?
I just would I don't I would like to see the evidence that you could have people actually have like base differences, like not just superficial differences about how to manifest the same values, but actually different values live side by side. I think that's the definition of war and conflict.
This
So
is something that would be a really good idea to go over with Hayden about.
I was just thinking that we should get him on to discuss James and pluralism.
Yeah.
So anyways,
Okay.
let's go back to this thing. All right.
Okay. So continuing on, Heidegger says, whatever is thus going to be put in the place of the supersensory world will be variations of the Christian, ecclesiastical, and theological interpretation of the world. Also continuing, he says, the realm for the essence and event of nihilism is metaphysics itself, always assuming that by metaphysics, we are not thinking of a doctrine or only of a specialized discipline of philosophy, but of the fundamental structure of beings in their entirety, so far as this entirety is differentiated into a sensory and a supersensory world, the former of which is supported and determined by the latter.
Oh, okay. So in that, oh, sorry.
Oh, let me do the last one.
Yeah.
So then he says, unbelief in the sense of apostasy from the Christian doctrine of faith is therefore never the essence or the ground of nihilism. Rather, it is always only a consequence of nihilism. For it could be that Christianity itself represents a consequence and a form of nihilism.
Okay. So, So does he mean that, like, nihilism itself, it has a view of metaphysics that, like, at least this is the, like, stereotypical view of nihilism is a way, is that, like, everything is meaningless or something like that, like that still qualifies as a metaphysical view? And also, what does he mean by Christianity in a way being nihilism?
Well, let's address the first one. So,
Okay.
one thing about nihilism that is not immediately obvious to some people, but those that are, say, a little more sophisticated with this, is a self-referential paradox. So if nihilism says everything is meaningless, nothing has no meaning, what about nihilism itself? That very statement. Okay? So classic self-referential paradox. So the first sentence, he's saying what is going to be put in place is variations of the Christian ecclesiastical and theological interpretation of the world. Okay, so he's already making a preview of what Nietzsche is going to put in place for God. If we say that God is dead, we got rid of God as in the supersensible realm. We didn't necessarily get rid of the supersensible or / metaphysical realm, because Nietzsche will put something else in its place, namely the will to power. We'll get to that later on. But that, and I've mentioned this before, is where Heidegger then says is that Nietzsche was the last great metaphysician.
Right.
Okay? Because, and the will to power was influenced to some extent by Schopenhauer's will. So the will in Schopenhauer is the metaphysical force for life and continuing life, even though life itself is a pessimistic approach, and even Heidegger mentions Schopenhauer later on in the essay.
Yeah, Schopenhauer was a pessimist, right?
Right, the pessimistic approach to life. Okay, but the will was a metaphysical principle. And so Nietzsche was influenced by that and said, no, it's not the will, it's the will to power. But it's still this force that exists kind of in a supersensible realm. And then the Christian ecclesiastical, I think what this means is that tied in with the will to power is Nietzsche's project of the transvaluation of all values. Because you've removed God as the linchpin of Western values hitherto. So then you're revaluing all values, coming up with a new set of values. Okay? So then in the second sentence, the realm of the event is not metaphysics itself, always assuming that by metaphysics, not thinking of a doctrine. The former is supported and determined by the latter. And then in the unbelief in the sense of apostasy from the Christian doctrine of faith is therefore never the essence or the ground of nihilism. Rather, it is always a consequence of nihilism, for it could be that Christianity itself represents a consequence in the form of nihilism. That's a little tougher to unpack.
I could see how it could be a consequence, but not a form of.
Okay, so how can you see it as a consequence?
Well, it's a response. It's like it's one possible way out of nihilism is Christianity.
Right.
So that way I could see it being a consequence. But I don't see how it would be unless there's some answer to that paradox earlier, I don't see how anything could be a form of nihilism. Unless you're also claiming that Christianity itself is a paradoxical, and that's the common element. But so I don't know what he means by the form part.
Okay, well, let's go ahead and take a look at the next paragraph, page 166. So he says at the top, from this point of view, we now recognize the final misstep to which we are still liable in grasping and supposedly battling against nihilism. Since we do not experience nihilism as a historical movement, which is already of long duration and whose essential ground lies in metaphysics itself, we fall victim to the pernicious desire to take the phenomena, which are in fact only the consequences of nihilism, for nihilism itself, or to represent consequences and effects as the cause of nihilism. In thoughtlessly accommodating ourselves to this manner of representation, we have for decades been used to adducing the dominance of technology or the revolt of the masses as the causes of the historical condition of our age. We tirelessly analyze the spiritual situation of the time in these respects. Yet every analysis, however knowledgeable and clever, of man and his position among beings remains thoughtless and produces only the semblance of reflection, so long as it refrains from thinking about a settlement for man's essence and from experiencing that place in the truth of being. Okay, so I think I understand what he's getting at here. So again, I bring into play the ontic ontological difference. Let's go back to my earlier example about depression. Okay, so if the ontic beings hold no meaning, then one descends into nihilism, no values. Everything is meaningless, but not in the ontological sense, because you're not even concerning yourself with at the time or even questioning anything about the ontological. Okay, make sense? It's kind of the missing the forest for the trees analogy.
Right.
Okay, so I think that's what he's getting at with nihilism. And particularly in Nietzsche's case, is that when you remove God, God is dead, then this engenders a nihilism, but a nihilism concerning what? Is it concerning the ontic beings, things in the world, or values themselves? They hold no meaning because there's nothing to hold them up. Or maybe there's meaning in them that is not necessarily tied to a God. So I think the point about Christianity is that you remove God, then you've either destroyed or seriously crippled Christianity. Okay? Now, there are some people who call themselves Christians because they believe in Jesus, but they don't necessarily believe in God. Separate issue.
So is that what that means in terms of like Christianity as a type of nihilism, like people who are Christians but they don't really thoroughly examine their beliefs? They're just like Christian by habit and due to their upbringing and stuff like that?
Yeah, nominal Christians. Yeah, I think that's a possible interpretation.
Okay.
Because they profess themselves as Christians and they go to church every Sunday, but they certainly don't live a Christian life, nor do they believe anything.
Right.
Christian doctrine.
Okay.
Conversely, though, you could have somebody like this is modern term cultural Christians, which I mean, one type of cultural Christian, or like, sorry, Christian atheists, some people call themselves. I think sometimes what they could mean is, I actually do believe in the metaphysical God that Nietzsche thought was dead, or at least I'm thinking I do. I don't believe in the sky God concept. So I think I'm an atheist, the same way Sam Harris thinks he's an atheist. That's his opinion, and everyone's entitled to their opinion. So in that sense, they think they're an atheist because they don't believe in a non-metaphysical God, let's say, who's like actually acting in the world, but they buy into the metaphysics, and then because they like the ethics, let's say. So anyways, that's just my little take there.
Yeah, as far as nominal Christians, or ones that are really not going in the other way, one can adopt a Christian ethics and still not believe in God. I don't think the two are mutually exclusive in that respect.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and then it also begs the question what God we're talking about. So
right.
Because the Nietzschean God is very different than what most atheists think they don't believe in. Is kind of I think we would all agree on that.
Right, because your garden variety atheist is going to kind of be like Nietzsche. When you talk about God, you're talking about the Christian God.
Yeah, like sort of the modern anthropomorphized like God who's an actual person and who lives in the clouds and that sort of thing.
Right. He answers my prayers. You know, he's looking out for me, type of thing. Yeah. Okay, so continuing. As long as the mere phenomena of nihilism are taken for nihilism itself, any opinion about it will remain superficial. And it does not help in the least when, out of discontentment at the condition of the world, or from a half-avowed despair, or from moralistic outrage, or from devout and self-righteous superiority, opinions take on a degree of frantic resistance. Okay, so it's a well-worn analogy. Don't mistake the forest for the trees.
Right.
Okay, continuing. In a note from 1887, Nietzsche poses the question, This is in The Will to Power. What does nihilism mean? He gives the answer that the highest values devalue themselves. Let me read that again. What does nihilism mean? He gives the answer that the highest values devalue themselves. Okay, so that's his definition of nihilism.
That's interesting.
Mm-hmm. So God, well, go ahead, Shane.
I was say, isn't that what I kind of said earlier in the sense that that's the paradox, right? Earlier, a second ago, I wondered if maybe the way Christianity is a form of nihilism in the sense that they both have this paradox, that paradox of the value devaluing itself.
Yeah, that sounds about right. The highest values devalue themselves. So God as the highest value is being devalued. That's what nihilism is.
Right.
Okay. So continuing, going to the next page, Heidegger says, yet in no way for Nietzsche is nihilism only a phenomenon of decadence. Rather, nihilism, as the fundamental process of Western history, an earlier point, is also and above all the intrinsic law of this history. For that reason, even in his observations about nihilism, Nietzsche cares rather little about describing the course of the process of devaluation historically, at the end deriving from it the decline of the West. Instead, he thinks nihilism as the inner logic of Western history. In this way, Nietzsche recognizes that, even with the devaluation of the hitherto highest values for the world itself remains, and above all, that the world grown valueless is inevitably impelled towards a new dispensation of value. After the hitherto highest values have lost their validity, the new dispensation of value is changed in regard to the former values into a revaluation of all values. Okay? So, the upshot of this is you remove God, you have nihilism. But the surface interpretation, what Heidegger was getting at, is mistaking the phenomenon of nihilism for nihilism itself, is that now you think that decadence darkens the land. You know, there's no linchpin, there is no overarching being that is the source of all value, so everything's going to hell in a handbasket. Okay, that's mistaking the phenomenon of nihilism for nihilism itself. But Heidegger continues is that, you know, going back to my earlier point, is that nihilism kind of was bound to happen at some point, given the way Western history has progressed up until now. As Nietzsche says, is the inner logic of Western history. But Nietzsche defines nihilism as the devaluation of the highest values. So now that those higher values have lost their validity, it is now time for a revaluation of all of those values. What will we put in its place? That's an open question right now. Okay, the revaluation of all values, key term, key notion within Nietzsche. Okay, you guys following so far?
Yeah.
Shane, you good?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I was going to repeat myself and just say that it's a little bit. It's the implication is the way the battle's going to play out, but I've already made that point, so I'm good.
Yes, right. Okay, so same time as revaluation. Yeah. So towards the end, Nietzsche affirms nihilism in the sense of revaluation of all values. Okay, so let me see if I can speed through some of these things here. On the next page, Heidegger talks about Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer's pessimism is a pessimism of weakness. However, Nietzsche is trying to go for a pessimism of strength. Okay. Let me go to page 169. Okay, Heidegger says, we can grasp Nietzsche's thoughts about incomplete nihilism more clearly and acutely by saying, incomplete nihilism indeed replaces the former values by others, but it always puts them in the old place, which is, as it were, preserved as the ideal region of the supersensory. Complete nihilism, however, must eliminate even the place of value itself, the supersensory as a realm, and it must accordingly alter and revalue values differently. Okay, key distinction here. So if we're talking about incomplete nihilism, you retain the supersensory. You just put something in its place. But complete nihilism is you do away with everything. That's where the revaluation of values comes in. So the decadence is tied, I believe, more to the incomplete nihilism than the complete nihilism. And that's mistaking the phenomenon of nihilism for nihilism itself.
So is Nietzsche's conception of nihilism then just a, like, as you said, a devaluation of values, in the sense that it's like just an absence of a distinct set of values?
Briefly, it is.
Okay.
So again, God is the linchpin of the values hitherto. Okay, God is dead. We have killed him, as the madman describes. You take God out of the picture. You take God out of the picture, and complete nihilism takes God out of the picture and takes his residence out of the picture. You're doing away with the supersensory. So because you no longer accept that, you do away with it. Everything is, so to speak, brought down to earth. You now have to regenerate the values, because there is nothing in the supersensible realm to refer them to as the basis. Okay. Think of it as a cleaning house. You clean house, and then you detonate the house. You get rid of it.
Yeah, and that assumes that's possible too.
That sounds like deconstruction.
No, that's not deconstruction.
No?
No. Remember that Derrida's project in deconstruction is to look at the play of signs within the text.
Yeah, that's true.
In that meaning is not something that's essential as a substance within the text. It's always in a reference to something else.
Yeah, that's true.
There are presuppositions within the text. Again, if you're talking about presuppositions, now let's try to make an analogy here. If you're dealing still with the presuppositions, it's kind of an incomplete nihilism. You thought there was one meaning to the text, but you find out that the meaning is actually coming from other texts itself.
Right.
Okay. But if it's complete nihilism, you're just doing away with the text.
Okay.
No reference at all. You start from scratch, in other words.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
And I'm just going to highlight that I have to see that might be possible, but I don't know that there's any evidence that is possible to do that, to have a complete nihilism. It's an open question at this point, because it's really theoretical.
Okay, so then continuing in the next paragraph, Heidegger says, it is clear then that the revaluation of all values is indeed part of the complete, fulfilled, and consequently classic nihilism. But the revaluation does not merely replace old values by new ones. Key point. The revaluing becomes a reversal of the nature and manner of valuing. The dispensation of value requires a new principle, that is, something that provides it with a point of departure and the place to maintain itself. The dispensation of value requires another realm. No longer can the principle be the world of the supersensory, now grown dead. Therefore, nihilism aiming at revaluation, understood in this way, will seek out what is most alive. All right?
So what does what is most alive mean in that context?
That's a good question. Okay, so the key point is when Nietzsche is attempting the revaluation of all values. Again, we've done away with God, we've done away with the supersensory. Not even going to put anything in its places, because we're not even thinking about that now. Now let's draw an analogy here. So, how best to describe this? In the current day, we already kind of do this, because what human beings had accepted as valuable, or their sense of values from centuries ago, some of that no longer holds true. So we don't even think that way. Like divination. Okay, you rip out somebody's entrails and you use that to predict the future. Okay, we no longer do that. It's because we did away with that. We no longer believe in it.
I read a book. I read a book a while ago, in which one part it was going over all the many different types of divination that people use, like divination by fingernails, divination by entrails, and like so many other things.
Yeah.
We haven't really we've done away with that particular type of divination.
Right.
But when you try to pull out conclusions from statistical information, you're still believing that you can go through a process of examining some form of evidence, determining a causal chain that will allow you to predict the future. So
Right.
So you mean like divination by science?
Yeah. So in that
Okay.
sense, I think that would be an example of incomplete nihilism, because you're replacing one system that basically is the same value structure like thing, and you're just subbing in a different one. The idea of starting with a clean slate, I would be really interested to hear an analogy that would actually hold in, because that's what I was trying to get at a second ago. I understand theoretically what he's describing. I just couldn't imagine what that would actually look like in any concrete term.
So you think there has to be like a distinct set of values?
Yeah, I mean, for me, like, for instance, what it would mean to not believe in a metaphysical God, I don't even know what that means. I don't even know, like, in concrete terms, you can say that. I understand what he's getting at, but like, no one's ever been able to explain to me what that would actually look like on planet Earth, not just described as a theoretical construct. So that's kind of like, that's what I'm waiting to hear. I'm waiting.
It looks like me.
Well, that's what you claim, right? So that's not, from what I've seen. That's not what I've seen so far.
That's right, Shane. We have a deity among us. We just didn't even know it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. My brother's on about trying to do this too. Like, and I'm just like, okay, what exactly does that mean? So, but anyway, so if you want to try another analogy of complete nihilism, I'd be very interested. Nihilism, sorry, I'd be happy to hear it. But anyways, I'm going to probably claim that as an example of incomplete nihilism.
Okay. So that's a good point. But to address your earlier question, Andrew, you're asking, well, what is most alive? So,
yeah,
again, we're not reading Nietzsche himself. We're reading Heidegger's interpretation of Nietzsche. But he does bring up some of the common themes that run throughout Nietzsche. So Nietzsche was very much influenced by Schopenhauer, for example. But then he came to repudiate Schopenhauer's because Schopenhauer was pessimistic. And as Heidegger notes earlier, this was a pessimism of weakness. This was the German term is a Bejahung, a yay saying versus a nay saying. You might recall the Apollonian and the Dionysian difference that's in Nietzsche. This comes from The Birth of Tragedy. Yeah. So the Apollonian is reason, rationality, whereas the Dionysian is life, the bacchanal and all that. So the Apollonian is life denying, the naysaying. And also this is where like the supersensory comes in, which is what Nietzsche was against, because the supersensory, particularly as you see in Platonic Christianity, is that it downplays the physical world, preferring instead the supersensory world. This life is a prison, it'll be over soon, and then you'll reside in this perfect supersensory world. Okay, that's the Apollonian. Whereas the Dionysian is, don't even worry about the supersensory. Let's not even think about that. You're working with the here and now, and you're saying yes to life. Okay, that's kind of it in a nutshell. So then, as Heidegger is saying, Nietzsche is trying to find out what is most alive. Well, what is this most alive? Stay tuned. We're getting to that.
Okay.
Okay. So
sounds like maybe the Dionysian.
Well, yeah, it's the Dionysian, but then in what form?
Right.
Now, because the Apollonian-Dionysian distinction, that was early on in Nietzsche's career. Now we're getting to the Will to Power, which is actually, it's just a collection of notebooks that his sister had put together after Nietzsche's death. So these were the late works. Okay.
Yeah.
So on page 170, Heidegger says, in a note, Nietzsche states what he understands by value. The viewpoint of value is the viewpoint of the conditions for preservation increase. That's a compound word, preservation dash increase, in regard to the complex structures relatively enduring of life in the midst of becoming. Okay, let me read that again. The viewpoint of value, and earlier Heidegger is saying in the 19th century there was a lot of talk of value. The viewpoint of value is the viewpoint of the conditions for preservation increase in regard to the complex structures, relatively enduring, of life in the midst of becoming. Okay? And continuing, Heidegger says, in characterizing value as a viewpoint, the one essential thing for Nietzsche's concept of value follows. As a viewpoint, value is always posited by a seeing and for a seeing. This seeing is of such a kind that it sees in it that it has seen, and that it has seen by representing to itself as a particular thing that which was cited, thereby positing it. Okay, following so far? How about you, Shane?
Yeah, he really, yeah, he beat that point to death. Yeah, he was very explicit about that. Yeah.
Okay, so then continuing, Heidegger says, value is value provided it is valid. It is valid provided it is posited as what matters. It is so posited by aiming and keeping one's sight on what must be counted. The point of sight, the regard, the field of view that is synonymous with sight and seeing, in the sense identified by the Greeks, but which has gone through the transformation of idea from eidos to perceptio. What is seen, what is perceived. And then, Heidegger continues, with values as points of view, the conditions for preservation increase are posited according to Nietzsche. By the way he writes this and omitting the and substituting a hyphen for it, because that's a compound word, Nietzsche intends to make it clear that values as viewpoints are, in their essence and therefore constantly, simultaneously conditions of preservation and increase. And then, preservation and increase mark the fundamental traits of life. These traits intrinsically belong together. The desire to grow, to increase, is part of the essence of life. To preserve life is to serve the increase of life. Any life that is restricted to mere preservation is already in decline. Okay, so the key term is preservation, increase. Not just preservation, but preservation, increase. If you're only preserving and you're not growing, you're already in decline.
Right. That
So
sounds
this is,
like a Stoic view.
Could. And this is what Nietzsche is getting at, is something that is more to life.
Right.
Because I also think that in reading Heidegger and reading Nietzsche here is that when Nietzsche pronounced that God is dead, he was doing a postmortem on something that was already static and dead anyway.
Okay.
So all one needed to do was just sweep it out of the way, close down the supersensory, and focus instead on the here and now in life.
Right.
Okay? And that happened, the stage was already set a long time ago for that to happen.
Is it this essay that uses the term sometimes dogmatic Christianity, or am I thinking of something else I've been exposed to recently?
I think you're something else.
Okay, because when I think of dogmatic Christianity, I think that seems to resonate with this already dead post-mortem form of Christianity.
Right, which even was the case back in Nietzsche's day. You know, the state religion. It's just this people that are nominal Christians or people that are going through the motions about being a Christian, and that is preservation. But as he says, is that things that are just in preservation are already in decline.
Yeah, and one thing I'll add is when he talks about growth and preservation, like in a biological sense, it's not only growth and preservation; it's also like cyclical rebirth, right?
Right.
It's like things that are alive get reborn, things
Right.
that are static get redone. And I'm not going to go on some Petersonian rant here about anything, but like the phoenix rises from the ashes. That theme of the thing is dead, and that's a natural part of it, just coming right back up again. That would be that was what you would like juxtapose against this post-Christian, post-God world that he's going to start laying out in the future. Because there's a lot of school of thoughts that would see the ossification and death as just the beginning of a new cycle.
Right. So yeah, that's a good way to interpret it. Is that Nietzsche? Remember, Nietzsche fundamentally, as I said, is when you look at the Apollonian and the Dionysian, Nietzsche was all for the Dionysian, to life, the Bejahung, the yes saying to life. So it made sense for him to say late in his life, in The Will to Power, the collection of his notes, is that he wanted something that was more yea saying, that was more to life, preservation increase, as he says, rather than the moribund, dogmatic, dead, lifeless, static Christianity that had existed up until then. And so him saying that God is dead is, again, just kind of a post-mortem to something that was already dead.
Right.
He just did it in a dramatic way with the aphorism of the madman and the gay science.
Right.
Okay. So, next page. Heidegger continues. When Nietzsche concludes his characterization of the essence of value with the word becoming, that final word points to the essential realm where values and the dispensation of value generally and uniquely belong. To become, that for Nietzsche is the will to power. Dun, da, da, da. So the will to power is the fundamental trait of life, which Nietzsche so often uses in a broad sense, by which it has been equated within metaphysics, compare Hegel, to becoming. Will to power, becoming, life, and being in the broadest sense have the same meaning in Nietzsche's language. Okay? And then the next paragraph. So long as Nietzsche, in his delineation of the essence of value cited above, grasps value as the viewpointed condition of the preservation and increase of life, but sees life as grounded in becoming and becoming as the will to power, the will to power reveals itself as that which sets those viewpoints. The will to power is that which, on the basis of its inner principle, as the Nisus in the essay of the ends, esteems according to values. The will to power is the ground for the necessity of dispensing values and the origin of the possibility of value estimation. So in other words, the will to power is becoming. The will to power also is what Nietzsche will use to replace God, but not in the supersensible realm. And the will to power is life affirming, preservation increase, and is a possible source of value estimation, of the new values. So this whole we're now doing the revaluation of all values. And what will the source of this be? The will to power. Okay? Shane,
Yeah.
I see a smirk on your face. Did we answer your... Is this now the denouement you have been looking for all this time?
No, I mean, I did read it through once. It's amazingly clear when I hear it auditorily. I notice that sometimes I have to read things out loud to hear them, so I'm kind of smirking because it's sounding a lot less pedantic, let's say, when you read it out loud
Right.
than it does when I read it internally. But no, it's just it's like rewatching a movie. You know, like you're waiting. You know, like there's that fight scene that's going to come at the end, and yeah. So you still have 34 minutes away. So please continue.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
So you got all this, what I said about the will to power. So we now know what Nietzsche has put in the place of God, more or less. Okay. So continuing on, next paragraph. This is why the will to power, as this principle that has been discerned and therefore willed, is at the same time the principle of a new dispensation of value. New because it is now achieved for the first time knowingly, and the knowledge of its principle. The dispensation of value is new because it itself makes its principle secure, and at the same time holds fast to this securement as a value established on the basis of its principle. As the principle of the new dispensation of value, however, the will to power is also, in relation to the former values, the principle of the revaluation of all former values. Yet because the hitherto highest values ruled the sensory from the height of the supersensory, and because metaphysics is what has structured that rule, to establish the new principle of the revaluation of all value is to bring about the reversal of all metaphysics. Nietzsche takes this reversal as the overcoming of metaphysics. Okay?
Okay.
So, going back to the beginning of the essay, is that Nietzsche's project was to overcome metaphysics. You say that God is dead, you have now eliminated the source of all transcendental values, we'll say, and you have closed down the supersensory. because up until then, the supersensory has ruled the sensory. Now, you have closed down the sensory, and you've closed down the supersensory, and now focusing on the sensory realm. What will you use as the revaluation of values, and something that is, as Heidegger points out, new, and the source of the new dispensation of value, generation of values? It's the will to power. Also, it is something preservation increase. So it is not static, just concerned with preservation, because then it will already be in decline. Preservation increase, preservation and growth, preservation and growth.
So how does the will to power accomplish that?
We'll get to that.
Okay.
Okay. So continuing, Heidegger says, the title will to power provides a fundamental word of Nietzsche's ultimate philosophy, which can therefore be fairly described as the metaphysics of the will to power. Aha! What the will to power means in Nietzsche's sense, we will never understand by means of popular ideas about will and power, but rather only by way of a reflection on metaphysical thinking. And that means also reflecting on the entirety of the history of Western metaphysics.
Okay.
Okay. So Heidegger continues on, and he's focusing on Thus Spake Zarathustra, which I will not, because it's a little bit long, repeating some of these things. Let me see if I can skip over some of this other stuff. Okay. So Heidegger says on page 177, the essential means are the conditions of the will to power itself that are posited by the will to power. Well, let me read this again, sorry. The essential means are the conditions of the will to power itself that are posited by the will to power itself. Nietzsche calls these conditions values. Okay, he writes, in all will is an esteeming estimation. To esteem means to constitute and ascertain value. The will to power esteems in that it constitutes the condition of increase and fixes the condition of preservation. In accordance with this essence, the will to power is the will that posits values. Values are the conditions of a preservation increase within the being of beings. The will to power, as soon as it comes to light specifically in its pure essence, is itself the ground and realm for the dispensation of value. The will to power has its ground not in a feeling of lack. Rather, it is itself the ground of the most abundant life. Life here means the will to will. Living, that already means to esteem.
So this sounds sort of like his sort of existentialist answer to nihilism that he goes through in Thus Spoke Zarathustra.
I'll be right back. Just give me a minute. You guys can feel free to continue.
Okay.
Sure. Yeah. So yes, and there was a big commentary there from Heidegger that I didn't go over about Thus Spake Zarathustra. So there is the will to power, and then Thus Spake Zarathustra is like a playing out of that.
Right.
Which incidentally, as we scan through this, is now so then we have the will to power, and then we have the revaluation of all values, and then is there somebody that can bring this about? I think there is.
The Übermensch.
The Übermensch, correct, which is sometimes translated as Superman, but I don't go for that one. I'd rather go for the Overman.
Okay. I just refer to it as Übermensch usually.
Yeah, the Übermensch. Yeah. Sometimes you're better off just sticking with the original term.
Yeah.
Okay, so then Heidegger goes on about justice, Nietzsche and justice, and let's get to here. Okay. Page, what is it? It's 187. With the consciousness that God is dead, a consciousness begins to form a radical revaluation of the hitherto highest values. Already seen this. After such consciousness, man himself moves into another history that is higher because in it the principle of all dispensation of value, the will to power, is specifically experienced and undertaken as the reality of what is real. as the being of beings. Self-consciousness, at which modern humanity has its essence, thereby takes the final step. It wills itself as the enforcer of the absolute will to power. The decline of normative values is at an end. Nihilism, that the highest values devalue themselves, is overcome. The humanity that wills its own being human has the will as the will to power, and finds this being human to be at home in the reality determined in its entirety by the will to power, is determined by a form of human essence that goes beyond erstwhile man. The name for this form of humanity's essence that goes beyond the previous race is the Overman. Okay, so we've now looked at the process, and we now look at the agent of this process and the revaluation of all values. Okay.
Yep.
And then more about the Overman, which we're going to get into. Okay, so then moving to page 190, Heidegger says.
But before you start that, I just want to make one observation that I think what he's trying to do here.
Yeah.
And I've seen, there's this American fellow who has apparently has an IQ of like 200.
Mm-hmm.
And he has this website up where he has his theory of everything.
Mm-hmm.
And I really want to read it, but I've only ever got 4 or 5 pages in. But one criticism he has and what he claims to be able to do is what other epistemologies lack, is the idea that the epistemology has to be able to explain itself.
Yes.
Right? And in the Christian conception, you basically concede you can't do that. So that's what God can do, and then that's why you have to serve God. And so I think what Nietzsche's trying to do, or the Overman would in theory be able to do, would be able to create a system that explains itself.
Correct.
And I think that's kind of what the will to power gets at. And
right.
So is that I'm in the ballpark, right?
Well, okay. So let's try to summarize this in such a way. So again, done away with God, done away with supersensory. Check. Reevaluation of all values. Check. The will to power is the source of preservation increase, and that is the force for the revaluation of all values. Check. However, there has to be a figure who can do this. The Overman. Check. And again, all this is, the will to power, revaluation of all values, and the Overman. These are the key notions within Nietzsche's work. Seem pretty consistent throughout most of his life, including in the will to power. And the will to power, again, is just a collection of notes that his sister put together at the end of his life, where he talked more about this preservation increase. Then thus spoke Zarathustra is a playing out of this. How is the Overman to do this? What does the Overman look like? And blah, blah, blah. Okay. So yes, I do believe is that Nietzsche was trying to explain what this was going to look like. Now, how is the Overman to come about? I can't say because I'm not a Nietzsche scholar. I might have missed it somewhere here and there. But that's the process. And did I answer your question, Shane?
Yeah, I think it does. And is this possibly why he posits art as the highest value? Because the only way that I can make that make sense is art is that process by which you would explore where you would explore that idea. And in Nietzsche's example, it seems to me like what he did is once you realize that in theory you could create a conception of the Overman, he actually tried to express it artistically first, right? To be able to discover it.
Right.
So, and when I'm lifting that right from Peterson pretty much too. So.
Yeah, well, I could bring in a side example here. So Hayden and I were doing a pragmatist podcast before this one, and I was focusing on some contemporary philosophers, namely Nelson Goodman, Donald Davidson, and Hilary Putnam. So Nelson Goodman was influenced heavily by pragmatism, but he was squarely within the analytic tradition. He talked about something called world making, which is very closely tied to his writings on aesthetics. Because definitely in the general conception is that when you're talking about art, the artist is making a world. It could be music, it could be a play, it could be a literature, it could be a sculpture, painting, whatever. You're creating a world.
That's why I identify so much with Nietzsche's concept of the Übermensch, the expressing it artistically, because I'm an artist.
Okay, well, you can identify with that. So you as an artist, when you create the world, you are not functioning according to strict concepts.
Yeah.
Unlike a philosopher or a scientist or somebody else of that ilk would.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yes, and then the idea that like the dichotomy there would be, to what extent are you actually creating a new world, or to what extent are you just thinking you are and actually building a Tower of Babel? So that's the theme that I'm keeping in the back of my mind as I look at this. Can you actually step outside the framework through art, through overmanning, to actually create this new world? Can you actually escape the metaphysics? That's
because the thing about the Overman is that it's just a concept. It's a notion. Nietzsche died when he was 44, so we don't know what he had in mind, apart from what we could see in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, but what the Overman looked like, what his function was, characteristics were, or if it could even be possible. You know, even in a side note is like the doctrine of the internal recurrence of the same. Okay, so scholars have gone back and forth. Is that really a metaphysical concept, or is that more like a thought experiment? You know, maybe the Overman was a thought experiment. We can't say for sure. But I would agree with that. Yeah, I think it's more of an artistic approach, and that's probably why he stuck him in Those Spake Zarathustra, because that was more of a poem than it was a philosophical treatise. Make sense?
Yeah, it was kind of a fable, right?
Yeah, it was a fable.
Yeah.
Yes. And you know who Zarathustra was, right?
I don't remember. Is that one of the No, I think I'm thinking of the wrong reference. I was thinking of an H.P. Lovecraft reference for a second, but that's a different one.
No, Zarathustra is another name for Zoroaster, the Persian.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Who, so scholars of religion have said, was the first to come up with the dichotomy between good and evil. And gee, isn't there a book where good and evil is in the title of Nietzsche's?
Beyond Good and Evil.
Yes. Okay. So we're almost at the end. I beg your patience. Okay, so at the bottom of 190, Heidegger continues. The place which metaphysically thought is proper to God is the region of causal effectivity and the preservation of beings as created beings. This region for God can remain empty. In its place, another, that is a place that corresponds to it metaphysically, can open up that is identical neither to the essential realm of God nor to the essential realm of man, who, however, is again entering into a distinctive relationship with this other place. The Overman does not, and not ever, step into the place of God. Rather, the place for the Overman's will is another realm of another grounding of beings in their other being. This other being of beings has meanwhile, and this marks the beginning of modern metaphysics, become subjectivity. Subjectivity? Yeah, subjectivity. I don't think I know what that means.
Yeah, I saw that word too. I copied and pasted the PDF, and I'm like, and it would copy certain things, and I'm like, is he making a new word here, or is that just subjectivity spelled wrong?
Maybe it's just subjectivity spelled wrong. Hard to say.
I think. Well, wouldn't subjectivity be like? Oh no, I'm sure if you knew your etymology, you could actually figure out what that word would mean based on its component parts. But I can't do it right now.
Right. Okay, so let me see. So yes, as he says, the Overman does not step in the place of God. Rather, he creates a new, for lack of a better term, a clearing as the grounding of beings.
It's like creating your own highest value in a way, right?
Right. Well, that's what the Overman is doing.
Yeah.
It is the key of the Overman possesses the will to power, which is the source of preservation increase, which is the revaluation of all values.
Right.
Okay. So then continuing, page 194, Heidegger says, the final blow against God and against the supersensory world consists in reducing God, the beingness of beings, to the highest value. The harshest blow against God is not that God is held to be unknowable, nor that God's existence is proved to be unprovable, but rather that the God who is taken for real is elevated to the highest value. This blow is the harshest precisely because it does not come from unbelievers standing about, but from the faithful and their theologians, who talk of the being most of all beings without ever letting it occur to them to think about being itself, capital B, and thereby become aware that this thinking and that talking from the perspective of the faith is absolute blasphemy when it is mixed into the theology of the faith.
What does that mean exactly by it being blasphemy?
Okay, well, let's unpack it a little bit. So Heidegger is restating an earlier point that God in the supersensory world was the highest value. And this is what Nietzsche was doing away with when he said that God was dead. Okay, checkbox. Harshest blow is that it is not meant to be unknowable, unprovable. God is taken for real. God is taken for real and is the highest value. So harshest because it does not come from unbelievers standing about. This is in reference to the madman passage. But from the faithful and their theologians, who talk of the being most of all beings without it letting it occur to them to think about being itself, and thereby become aware that this thinking and this talking from the perspective of the faith is absolute blasphemy when it is mixed with the theology of faith. So I think this harkens back to the earlier essay, the Phenomenology and Theology, where Heidegger was talking about theology as a science, but it's ontic. And the thing about theologians, as I interpret from this, is that theologians are creedal. They're pretty sure, and they talk about what has already been established. God, Jesus, the incarnation, salvation, whatever it is. But then they don't ask about being, the being most of that. And that's what is blasphemous.
Okay.
That makes sense?
Yeah,
Yeah,
I
I
think
think
it
so.
also might have something to do with the fact that if you build up God to define Platonic, static, dogmatic, or positivist sense, you're eliminating his transcendent nature, and it's in that transcendent nature that the capital B being exists, because you're referencing the fact that there's something outside of your viewpoint, right? So if you reduce your religion to only ontics and you don't leave in the ontological realm, then by definition you're leaving something out. And once you make something concrete, then it's always going to have a contradiction in it, because it's going to be incomplete. There's nothing besides the sum total. Everything is complete, and I think that's part of where the blasphemy comes in, because if you define God too tightly or the truth too tightly, then you're basically assuming you have an omnipotence that you can't possibly have.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
So.
I'll go with that. What do you think, Andrew?
That makes sense.
Yeah, well, this also ties into the discipline of negative theology, which is the attempt to not define God.
Right.
Instead of what God is. Because when you define God by certain predicates, I would like to look at that one book by Graham Oppy about defining or describing gods, of all the ways that one in Western philosophy and religion has defined God. That as soon as you define God, as Shane was saying, you define him too tightly, then you are setting yourself up for difficulty.
That sounds like the way that that Heidegger describes the concept of nothing.
Yes. Because remember, he was saying is that when you talk about the nothing, then you make it into something.
Right.
There's that paradox, that trap that exists. Okay? So, skipping through, he's got metaphysics, he's got nihilism, restating again. And towards the end, okay, last page, 199, Heidegger says, the man deranged in this way, he's referring to the madman, has then nothing in common with the sort of men standing about in public, who do not believe in God. For these are not unbelievers because for them God, as God, has become unworthy of belief, but because they themselves have abandoned the possibility of faith, since they are no longer able to seek God. They can seek no longer because they can no longer think. Those standing about in public have abolished thinking and replaced it with gossip that smells nihilism everywhere. It fears its opinions are threatened. The self-delusion, which is perpetually gaining the upper hand against genuine nihilism, is trying in this way to talk away its dread at thinking. This dread, however, is dread at dread.
Okay.
So he's kind of referring to an earlier point. In the madman passage, the madman is the one that is deranged. But the madman is very distinct from the people saying, well, what happened to God? I mean, is he lost? And things like that. These are the bystanders who are not as innocent as they might appear to be. And so these would be the type that are too easily to fall on the prey of focusing on the phenomena of nihilism rather than nihilism itself, which is what the madman is concerned with. The madman is, we've killed God, so now it is time for a reevaluation of all values, versus the people standing around who are the incomplete nihilists and now degenerating to decadence or something along those lines.
Oh, okay.
Okay? So, that's it. That was a long essay. I think Heidegger probably could have shortened it, but there's a lot in there, a lot to unpack. And it isn't until I think we get to the Nietzsche lectures where he really starts to get into the assertion is that Nietzsche was the last great metaphysician. However, he touches on this somewhat when he talks about the will to power, because Nietzsche came up with the will to power as the substitute for what happened with God in the supersensory realm and what the characteristics of that are. But it still seems to be something that Nietzsche believed in, maybe not necessarily supersensory, but is this kind of quasi-metaphysical concept, this notion that exists as the source of the revaluation of all values. So in the end, Nietzsche was really did not completely overturn metaphysics, as he maybe thought he would.
So it's like a not supersensory, but still semi-metaphysical conception, as you put it.
Right, because one can talk about metaphysics, and in fact, philosophers have been talking about metaphysics for centuries without even referring to God. You know, the Greeks talked about metaphysics all the time, but they didn't refer to the Christian God because the Christian God hadn't yet arrived on the scene.
Right. Yeah, that more Hellenistic view of God is interesting to me, as we've gone over before.
Yeah. So that, I think that would be a good subject for another podcast too, is that we would go to the Neoplatonists and see what they had to say, like Plotinus, when they talk about the one, the Tohen, which is a proto-God, and the Christians read a lot into that, but it's not the Christian God. And as Heidegger outlined in this essay, Nietzsche was against the Christian God, but also the Christian Platonist God, but against the church. And so he was looking for his reevaluation of all values, which he found in the will to power, and the overman was the one to set the impetus in play for that. But then what was that going to look like? Maybe that was just a thought experiment. Who knows?
Right.
But I think we've come to the essence of what God is dead mean. The absence of the supersensory Christian Platonist God.
Right.
Okay. And that's it. I'm spent.
All right.
Any further questions, comments?
Well, I just find it personally interesting that once he rejects a definable version of God, he returns to faith in something that's still basic metaphysics, which is essentially what Christianity has always been, in my opinion, which is a faith in a metaphysics that you can't fully define. So I mean, he might have been able to transcend that or go to somewhere else, or maybe find a way to manifest the Übermensch. But I think he's right back where the early Christians started, more or less, with or this metaphysics that can't be defined in concrete terms. And then secondly, and only by defining God too tightly can you say in any real sense that the Christian God, who literally existed from the beginning of time, somehow came into existence at a certain point. It would
Wouldn't
be
you say, sorry,
I'll just so just to end that thought, it's only by defining God in a positivistic sense could you possibly say that God died, or could you say there was a time where it didn't exist. Whereas in the more transcendent version of God, which I think is what the Christians are talking about, always existed, will always exist, and cannot be destroyed. Only these straw man or concrete manifestations can be torn down.
wouldn't you
Or the
say that,
dogmatic.
sorry, I interrupted you.
That's enough. That's enough. I was just going to expand upon it and repeat myself.
Wouldn't you say that there's been positive theological interpretations, like people attempting to define God for a long time?
Well, I would just do it. I would, if you were forced to do it, I would do it how Peterson did it in those lectures, which is God is like. This is one expression of God. This is a statement which points towards God. Because I think the best you can do is say this collection of ideas, words, symbols point towards something that has a God-like shape. But you can't box it, you know? Like you can say what it isn't, you can say part of what it is. But the moment you start to, and I think once you build it into political ideologies in particular, you're going to start making it too concrete. It's going to ossify, and then that will die. And I think that's where the nihilism would probably come in. So,
right, and then connected with the preservation increase is that the unfortunate tendency of Christianity, definitely up into Nietzsche's time, is that it, as Shane was saying, it ossified because it didn't change.
Mm-hmm.
In particular. And, you know, in recent years, like within the 20th century, that's big part and parcel about why Vatican II happened, because the Catholic Church needed to change.
So if it's a bad idea, to define God, then to me that seems like a good place to put in the idea of pragmatic pluralism from William James if you're talking about religion. But I know you don't agree with that, Shane Kennedy.
Well, I think it's an okay thing. Like what I always say to my brother is like, or to an atheist or to a humanist, it's like obviously the ossified version of Christianity couldn't continue. I mean, maybe some Christians think it could. I don't think that's viable. Something has to rise up and replace it. And out of humility, I'm not going to define what that is. So what I would always say is what my preference is to resurrect the true spirit of Christianity. But I mean, to be fair, given that things have changed so much, perhaps there is a will to power that's going to be manifested, and we're all going to, go to that. I think in a pragmatism or the Darwinian process is going to select what the next belief system is going to be, whether it's a revival of an old one, whether it's something new, whether it's a synthesis, who knows what forms it would take. But I would definitely say I would support pluralism to the extent that we're obviously searching for some new underlying narrative, worldview. There's obviously some sort of hole there, right? And I think my greatest fear, and this may be going to left field a little bit, my greatest fear is that while us in the West are having this debate, other societies or worldviews that we would not want to have might just by demographic pressure or just by us falling in on ourselves will just kind of replace us. Like I think the worst future is where in a society where, let's say, some version of China takes over the whole planet because it just operates well, and then in that system you don't even have these discussions because it's not relevant to the orthodoxy of the state or the way society is manifesting, and then this basically debating all these questions, destroying the very environment that allows us to have the discussion in the first place. So okay. I would just hope that we come up with something new in time before the decision's kind of made for us, so to speak.
Yeah, I think that's a good place to end because I'm falling asleep.
Okay.
And this was a long essay. I'm glad that I got through it. Hopefully it was helpful for you guys, but some of these other things, I definitely think we need to get Hayden on to to talk a little bit more about James and James and particularly pluralism, because we were touching on James a little earlier in the previous podcast, but it was, we tried to keep it in under an hour, and we were focusing on these other things.
Oh, okay.
But
yeah, I just want to hear more. I would want to hear Hayden's perspective in particular on this, because I think that, like, if you don't have pragmatic pluralism, it seems to me like you would have to have a positive interpretation of God and define it too strictly, which would lead to the ossification of religion. And I also am curious about what you mean by the spirit of Christianity in the first place, Shane. So we should maybe talk about those and pragmatic pluralism, and I'm sure lots of other different topics when we hopefully talk with Hayden soon.
I think it's good for us to focus on maybe negative theology for another podcast.
Sure.
Yeah. I wish I could get Graham Oppie's works. I have a couple of them, but not, well, do I have those ones? I'll have to go check and see if I had them in PDF yet. But those are interesting because it's analytic philosophy of religion, really focus.
He literally fell asleep mid-sentence. Heroic.
Oh, did he cut off for you too?
I imagine it's going to reconnect in a second. But yeah, no, I think I'll stop talking if and when Tim returns. But I think we all more or less agree with the paradigm put out by Nietzsche, explained by Heidegger. It kind of sets the stage, so to speak, and then it's quite a natural jumping off point to different ways to kind of either get out of this problem, understand it better, etc. I mean, I'm sort of this. We'll give Tim, if you get back, you can. But in terms of this spirit of Christianity thing, I mean, I'm still working my way through the New Testament. I'm deep diving into this Christianity thing a lot, and it's to exactly figure out what it is it's going to take me a while more. So what I'm doing with this is I'm kind of hearing all these other points of view is helping me build, because I'm big into assertion, as you've noticed. I'm kind of trying to build clearer what my conception is. So we'll see. I'll just say though that, like, to some extent, like, you're so better off just putting your faith in God and getting down to practical concerns.
You're way too Christian.
It works, man. Don't I would never, if you told me I was going to say things like I'm saying right now, even 4 years ago, I would have been like, nothing. But
it doesn't work for everyone. It works for sure for lots of people.
Okay, guys, break.
Oh, you're back? Oh, yeah. I thought
No. I mean, I need to go because I really am falling asleep. But I don't want you guys to get into blood sports here. But.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. Thanks, Tim. Yeah, that was great. That was wonderful. Thank you so much.
Okay. Yeah. So we'll talk again.
Yeah, have a good night.
All right. Yeah. Thanks a lot, both of you guys. And yeah, let's do another one soon. And thanks everyone for watching another episode of the Mindgasms podcast. I hope you guys enjoyed it as much as I did. And you guys have any final words or plugs or anything there?
No, we did that. We're good. We'll stay there.
Get plenty of sleep, which I'm about to do.
All right.
Good night.
All right. Thanks a lot.
Okay.
Adios, everyone, and see you next time.